Welcome to the FloridaDefense.com podcast. With over 30 years of strong defense and over 30 years of even stronger results, with FloridaDefense.com, you'll never believe you can't win.
All right, welcome to FloridaDefense.com podcast. We are speaking to Tampa burglary charges defense lawyer Mike Kinney at the Bauer, Kreider, and Perry law firm in Tampa, Florida. And,
Morning.
Mike, we've been speaking on theft crimes. Last edition, we talked about robbery charges. Today, we're going to be talking about burglary, which are two different areas, correct?
That's right. It's kind of funny. People kind of use those terms. You kind of hear people discuss them. I think lay folks might use the term robbery when they say my house was robbed. But there's specific terms. These are like terms of art in the legal world. A burglary specifically means a theft from a particular location. And there are certain elements that have to be established in order for something to qualify as a burglary. Whereas robbery is like what we talked about before. Robbery means that the way the item was taken, whether a person used some kind of force to take it, some threat of force, or whether the victim at some point became aware during the course of the taking that an item is being stolen from them. So they're all theft related, but a burglary specifically means the entering or remaining in a dwelling, which is basically a home, structure, which is something that is not a home but like a business, or conveyance, which is an automobile or anything that basically transports folks, with the intent to commit an offense therein. And then there's an exception, unless the premises are at the time open to the public or the defendant is licensed or invited to enter. So that's your basic burglary. A person enters a home with the intent to commit a crime inside, and that essentially is a burglary. And it doesn't have to be that they have to steal something, but that's, in the vast majority of burglary crimes, that's what happens. A person breaks into a home and steals some item, a television, property, medicine, any one of those items. And depending upon what type of place that they entered determines the severity of the crime. Generally speaking, a burglary of a conveyance, like a car, is a third-degree burglary. If a person opens up, walking down the street and they're opportunists and they check the door handles to find out what cars will open in the middle of the night, and they find one that opens. Once they reach inside and take whatever items they can get, that's a burglary. And that's a burglary of the third degree. That's a burglary of a conveyance. A person goes to a home, enters the home, and walks out with a television set. That's a burglary of the second degree, punishable by up to 15 years in prison. A person who gets convicted for the first time burglary, even if they have no prior criminal history, scores on the score sheets that we use in Florida a minimum of 21 months in the Department of Corrections, so almost 2 years, even with no prior criminal history. And that doesn't change unless there's some type of reduction to the charge or some negotiated, plea disposition. The judge really doesn't have any discretion there. And then there's the third-degree burglary that comes up in businesses. Person breaks into a store that may be closed at night and walks out with something. So that's the basic definition of a burglary, that you enter with the intent to commit an offense therein. So why does that matter, the intent to commit an offense therein? Well, that's pretty important because that's what separates a felony in a lot of cases from a misdemeanor. So say we have, which I've seen as a prosecutor, a lot of times you might have had some homes that were abandoned for a while, and maybe there were some homeless individuals who ended up spending the night in the home. And as they're spending the night in the home, I don't know, maybe they damaged some of the property. Well, in that case, probably most of the time, the person, when they entered the home, didn't have an intent to commit an offense therein. Just walking into a home and taking a nap or going to sleep is not really anything other than a trespass, which is a misdemeanor. Doesn't carry any kind of prison sentence whatsoever. If the person enters the home and ends up stealing something, or enters the home and ends up causing some type of criminal mischief or damage, courts have decided that you can use the act that is committed to prove that was the initial intent upon entering. There's another way to prove intent, and they say that you don't have to prove the intent to commit an offense therein if the person is entering the home surreptitiously, meaning entering the home under cover of darkness, maybe disguised in the middle of the night, sneaking in. if that's able to be established, you don't have to prove what the person's intent was. But in all burglary cases, a basic element that the prosecutor has to prove to the jury is at the time of the entry, this person intended to commit a crime. I have seen plenty of cases, both as a prosecutor and as a defense lawyer, where you have individuals who are friends or associates or acquaintances who know each other. A person is invited into the home. At some point, there's an argument, and maybe a battery happens. Somebody hits somebody inside the home, or somebody breaks some items and maybe even walks out with something. None of those instances are burglaries unless certain elements are established, because the person was invited into the home. So you don't have the unlawful entry into the home. You have maybe a crime that happened inside, which would be no different really than if it happened outside, a battery, a theft, a criminal mischief. So what a person can, however, a homeowner can remove that person's invitation to enter, but that has to be announced to them saying, hey, you're no longer welcome here, you need to leave. And then if a crime is committed, then potentially the state can establish a burglary charge. But burglaries can be pretty serious because they carry pretty stiff sentences. Kind of like the robbery charges, they elevate depending upon how the crime is committed and whether or not a weapon is used. If during the course of committing a burglary, a person is armed, well then you end up getting yourself in a situation where you have a life felony. And that is obviously, essentially in most crimes, the ultimate sentence you can get, aside from capital punishment and death case, is life imprisonment. So if a person enters a home with a firearm or with let's say with a deadly weapon like a knife or a billy club, that is punishable by life. The other thing that makes it punishable by life is if someone breaks into a home and at some point during that entry into the home, there's someone inside the house and that person gets hit, or there's a threat to hurt that person, that is punished much more severely, and that's a punishable by life felony. So once there's a person inside the home, things kind of elevate a little bit, especially if there's some threat to be made. Now, the unique thing that I have seen as both a prosecutor and as a defense lawyer, what happens a lot and what makes what seem like very insignificant crimes in the grand scheme of things very, very serious, is these road rage type cases. And these are the cases where somebody determines that somebody's driving wasn't courteous or wasn't proper, and at some point some guy gets out of his car and walks over to the other person and maybe punches him as he's seated inside of his car. Well, that could be two things. That could be a battery, hitting somebody. That could be a trespass in a battery, meaning once the hand crosses the threshold of the window of the car, or that could be a punishable by life first-degree burglary, because it's a burglary of a conveyance. It's the unauthorized entry into the car, and there's an intent to commit a crime inside, and that intent to commit a crime happens to be, during the course of committing that, is an assault or battery. There's been a lot of cases where some famous folks who have been involved in situations like that, and it's one of those things that happens to a lot of people. That's that one moment in life that somebody maybe loses composure. They end up doing what in all cases would be something punishable by probation. They end up committing a crime that has a very severe punishment, a minimum amount of time in the Department of Corrections, up to a maximum of life.
You mentioned that there's a difference between home and also property or business.
Right.
Correct.
Right.
I know I was a teenager once. I didn't do it, but a lot of people will go into a store, grab a case of beer, run out.
Right.
But you said that they had to prove that they had intent to do that, I guess, beforehand. Is that correct?
There's more than that. There's more than that, because one of the essential parts to prove a burglary is that the person entered unlawfully.
Okay.
So when you enter a business, obviously everyone's invited to enter a business.
Right.
So that's why when a person walks into a business during regular hours and steals a case of beer, that's a theft. It's not a burglary.
Okay, that would be under the robbery, sudden snatching.
Or it wouldn't even be under that, because the person it's a theft because unless the attendant is the person you're stealing from, or the person behind the counter, when you walk in, you steal a beer from the cooler, a case of beer from the cooler, and you walk out. that person may see it and realize it, but you're not taking it from that person.
Okay.
If you walked in and you took something that was on the attendant, like you picked his pocket and he turned around and he saw you, that might change things. So the way you transition that, what we were just talking about, from a theft to a burglary, is you'd have to break into the store in the middle of the night, when the store is closed and not open to the public. There is another scenario where if you're in a place that's open to the public, but you cross the threshold and go into an area that's closed off, for instance, like where you see a door that says employees only.
Right.
If you open that door in the section of a store, the state might be able to establish the elements needed to prove that you entered somewhere unlawfully, that you had no invitation to enter, and you took something from there, and that would be a burglary.
And then, well, this isn't necessarily probably under burglary, but how you see the people that they walk in, they act like they have a gun in their pocket.
That's a robbery.
Okay. And they don't necessarily have a gun, but that's
right.
With force or threat, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
That would be a second degree robbery,
okay.
Unless they can prove. Now here's the unique thing about that. In the end, that's going to be a jury question.
Okay.
I can tell you that if a guy walks in and he has something in his like he has his hand in his pocket of his sweatshirt or something like
right.
that, and makes it look at it as if it's a firearm, if that person gets arrested later, let's say a day later, the testimony is going to be the attendant's going to say, "I thought I saw a gun,"
right?
And that's going to be the evidence. So obviously a good defense lawyer is going to hone in on, can they prove that this person was armed, because you've just taken a second degree felony and made it a punishable by life felony. But the jury is the one who's going to decide whether the person was armed or not.
Okay.
Just because they don't find a weapon doesn't mean the prosecutor might not try to, convict that person of a armed robbery.
Okay. Anything else on burglary charges, Mike? That
pretty much covers the general course of burglaries. There is this element of a burglary that involves kind of a robbery, and that's a home invasion robbery. And that's when a person breaks into the house and ends up robbing someone using force or threat of force to take something from that person. That is kind of its own unique crime, and that is kind of has the same levels. If a person uses a firearm or other deadly weapon, he commits a felony of the first degree, punishable by life. And then if he commits a home invasion robbery and carries a weapon, he commits a first degree felony, which is not punishable by life, but punishable by 30 years. And then with no weapon, it's simply a second degree. A felony of the first degree, again, punishable by 30 years in prison.
All right. Well, we've got 2 more podcasts that we're going to be recording here, and that will be over property crimes and stolen cars. And this is the Tampa burglary charges defense lawyer, Mike Kinney, at Bauer, Kreider, and Perry. Join us for our next edition of FloridaDefense.com podcast.
Thank you for listening to the FloridaDefense.com podcast. Our firm has over 130 years of combined legal defense experience. Strong defense, stronger results. Consultations are free. Visit FloridaDefense.com today.